What do gold bars, sugar plantations, and the rise of capitalism have in common? No, it's not the plot of a bad pirate movie. I'm talking about mercantilism, the economic system that dominated Europe before capitalism took over. Today, we're diving into how mercantilism worked, who gained, who lost, and how slavery fueled this economic engine. Before the Industrial Revolution, most societies were agrarian. Farmers produced just enough to survive, maybe trade a little surplus in local markets. Wealth was measured in land and tribute, not productivity or innovation. Of course, there was overseas trade. Think the Silk Roads, Indian Ocean trade, and African gold and salt caravans, but most of the world wasn't part of a unified global economy yet. But in the 16th century, European empires, that is Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands, began building vast colonial networks, and this is where mercantilism entered the picture. At its core, mercantilism argued that wealth is finite. If Spain got rich, Portugal couldn't. So nations competed for gold, colonies, and trade monopolies. And what was the goal? Export more than you import and hoard all the gold. So this led to a series of policies and practices designed to concentrate wealth in the hands of the state. Let's review a few key concepts associated with mercantilism. Bullionism. Accumulating gold and silver was seen as the foundation of wealth and power. The more bullion you had, the richer and stronger your nation supposedly was. Protectionism. High tariffs, trade restrictions, and monopolies shielded domestic industries. Colonies couldn't trade with other countries. That would be independence, and of course, we can't have that. Navigation Acts. This was England's clever strategy to force its colonies to trade only with the mother country using English ships. Think of it like Amazon banning third-party sellers and then raising prices. Colonial monopolies. Governments granted exclusive trading rights to companies like the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, creating early mega corporations backed by state power. So who benefited? European states and their monarchies grew rich. More gold meant more wars, more forts, and prestige. Merchants and financiers in Europe made fortunes on government-backed monopolies. And of course, state elites, who handed out trade privileges like party favors at a Versailles banquet. But all that gold and sugar didn't come from nowhere. Let's look at the transatlantic slave trade, the most brutal engine of mercantile profit. Mercantilism demanded cheap, large-scale labor to make colonies productive. And in the Americas, that meant plantations, especially sugar, tobacco, coffee, and later cotton. But indigenous labor collapsed quickly due to diseases, displacement, and sheer cruelty. So European powers turned to Africa, and what emerged was the infamous triangular trade. European goods, that is textiles, rum, guns, were shipped to Africa. These were exchanged for enslaved Africans who were then forced across the Atlantic on the Middle Passage, a horrific journey where up to 20% died. Those who survived were put to work on the plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America. And the products of their labor, that is sugar, tobacco, molasses, were then shipped back to Europe. It was efficient, it was global, it was profitable. It was also one of the most horrific systems of human exploitation in history. Let's take an example. Sugar plantations in Barbados. By the 1660s, this tiny island became the most valuable English colony, not because of its size, but because of sugar. It required enormous labor, and by the 1680s, the majority of the population there were enslaved Africans. Life expectancy of an enslaved person, well, probably under 10 years after arrival. Now, the plantations generated enormous wealth for English merchants and the crown, financing everything from London mansions to naval fleets. Or take Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. By the late 1700s, it produced 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee. It was the most profitable colony in the world and arguably the most brutal. Enslaved people were worked to death, replaced constantly with new shipments, and the wealth from Saint-Domingue helped fund the French economy. Well, until it exploded in the Haitian Revolution. So under mercantilism, we have colonies supplying raw goods under tight restrictions. European states hoarding wealth and dictating trade. Plantations extracting profit from the labor of enslaved people. And so this brings us to a major question. What changed with capitalism? Capitalism, particularly after the Industrial Revolution, flipped many assumptions of mercantilism. First, wealth was no longer seen as finite. Capitalists believed that investing in machines, labor, and production could create wealth. Second, the focus shifted from colonies to markets. Now, the ideal capitalist buyer wasn't a colony under force. It was a free consumer with money in their pocket. Third, wage labor began to replace slavery in industrial economies. Though let's be clear, conditions in early factories were not exactly utopian. In capitalism, the state steps back, well, at least in theory, letting the invisible hand guide production and trade. Private individuals or firms own the means of production. Profit becomes the driving force, not bullion or balance of trade spreadsheets. So why then did Britain, of all countries, lead the charge in abolishing slavery? Here's the twist. Britain didn't abolish slavery purely out of moral awakening. Yes, abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson and Ignatius Sancho made powerful cases, but also industrial capitalism didn't need slave labor anymore. British factories needed wage workers and consumers. You can't sell to slaves who earn nothing. Colonies were no longer valuable just as sources of raw goods. They became crucial as captive markets where European manufacturers could sell textiles, tools, and other industrial products. Abolitionism also gave Britain moral high ground over rival colonial powers who still used slavery. And it undercut plantation economies in the Caribbean, many of which were no longer as profitable as they once were. In 1807, Britain outlawed the slave trade, and by 1833, slavery was officially abolished in the empire. But don't be fooled. Slave labor still existed elsewhere, and British capital quickly turned to indentured labor, recruiting workers from India, China, and Africa to toil on the plantations in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Africa. In many ways, indenture was slavery's successor, cheap, controlled labor that kept plantations running under a new capitalist labor. Exploitation didn't end, it just changed names. Let's take Brazil. It was colonized by Portugal in the early 1500s. By the 17th century, Brazil became the world's leading sugar producer. The Portuguese developed sprawling plantations that relied almost entirely on enslaved African labor. Now, historians estimate that about 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships, and around 10 to 11 million survived the Middle Passage to reach the Americas. Brazil was the single largest destination. The Caribbean was the largest regional destination outside Brazil. Together, Brazil and the Caribbean accounted for the vast majority of the transatlantic slave trade. And let's not forget South Carolina, where rice plantations flourished thanks to the knowledge and labor of enslaved Africans from the rice coast of West Africa, which would be modern day Senegal, Gambia, and Sierra Leone. Now, these Africans were not just laborers, they were agricultural experts whose rice growing skills were deliberately targeted by slave traders. So when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we're not just talking about ships and numbers. We're talking about systemic, targeted exploitation of people and knowledge under the banner of national wealth and mercantilistic logic. It's easy to roast mercantilism today, but let's be fair. To the 17th century thinkers, it made sense. If your neighbor got rich, they might fund an army and invade. Wealth wasn't seen as growing. It was stolen, seized, or hoarded. So the logic of controlling colonies and restricting trade felt like national defense. But mercantilism didn't go unchallenged. Enter the Enlightenment, a movement that questioned absolutist rule, church authority, and yes, economic orthodoxy. Philosophers like John Locke argued for natural rights and property ownership. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations skewered mercantilism for being zero-sum and restrictive. He introduced the idea of the invisible hand, a metaphor for how individuals pursuing self-interest in free markets could actually benefit society as a whole. Adam Smith argued that free trade, not state-controlled monopolies, created real prosperity. He wasn't against all government intervention, but he believed that mercantilism's obsession with hoarding gold and restricting imports was actually holding nations back. Now here's the irony. Adam Smith's book was published the same year the American colonies declared independence. The colonies weren't just fighting for liberty, they were rejecting a mercantilistic system that tied their economies to British interests. That's why they bristled at the Navigation Acts, taxes on tea, and the Proclamation Line. The revolution was political, yes, but also deeply economic. Let's talk about who really lost. We've said enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples were the biggest losers, and that's absolutely true. But let's look even closer. In Africa, the slave trade destabilized entire regions. Some kingdoms like Dahomey and Asante benefited in the short term by trading captives, but many others faced population loss, civil war, and dependency. Long-term economic development was strangled by a system that commodified human lives instead of building industry or infrastructure. In the Americas, the plantation system hollowed out societies. Cash crops made profits for a few, while most people, especially the enslaved, lived short, brutal lives. Internal markets and diversified economies were discouraged because colonial powers wanted raw goods, not competition. Even ordinary Europeans suffered. Sure, elites and merchants got rich, but mercantilistic monopolies meant higher prices, limited access to goods, and no say in policy. In France, the tax system exempted the nobility and clergy while squeezing peasants and artisans. Sounds a bit like a pyramid scheme, except with fewer disclaimers and more muskets. So what changed with the shift to capitalism? When capitalism rose in the 18th and 19th century, it wasn't just about industrial innovation. It was about ideological transformation. Capitalism emphasized private ownership, profit as a signal of efficiency, investment in machinery, labor, and technology, and perhaps most importantly, markets as the engine of wealth. This meant breaking down the monopolies and restrictions of mercantilism. But did capitalism end exploitation? Of course not. Instead of enslaved labor on plantations, we got wage labor in textile mills, often by children and women. Colonial markets where goods were dumped and local industries destroyed. New imperialism, where British and the French used free trade rhetoric to dominate colonies in Asia and Africa. And here's a twist. Even as slavery was abolished, the same powers found new ways to exploit labor through indentured servitude, land dispossession, and resource extraction. Now you might be wondering, why does any of this matter today? Because mercantilism never truly died. Its ghost lives on in modern trade wars, where countries slap tariffs on each other's goods to protect domestic industry. Resource extraction from the global south by multinational corporations. IMF and World Bank policies that restrict how developing countries manage their economies, ironically echoing colonial controls. So yes, capitalism replaced mercantilism, but many of its structural inequalities were simply upgraded, not eliminated. In that sense, capitalism didn't overthrow the colonial order. It retooled it, keeping the same reliance on extraction and coerced labor, just in different forms. Mercantilism was born of conquest, control, and fear. It built empires with gold, sugar, and stolen lives. Capitalism promised freedom but often delivered new forms of domination under a different name. Understanding the difference between the two isn't just a history lesson. It's a way of asking deeper questions. What systems shape the way we live and trade today? Who wins and who gets left behind? History doesn't return in the same form, but it leaves traces that continue to shape the present in unexpected ways. Thanks for watching.